Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving deep into the life of one of the most uh, dynamic and just consequential figures in the Hebrew scriptures, the prophet Elijah.
Mm.
This is such a powerful narrative. It's a story that's marked by these spectacular acts of God, intense personal courage, and maybe surprisingly, moments of really profound human weakness.
Oh, it really is. It's a master class in faithfulness under just immense spiritual pressure.
Right.
Elijah's story is, it's a foundational text for believers looking to understand not just prophetic history, but the radical nature of total devotion to God.
And his name itself is a declaration, right?
It is. The Lord is God.
Yeah.
And his entire ministry, which just sort of appears out of nowhere, was the confrontation that was needed to make that truth undeniable in a nation that had basically forgotten it.
So our whole deep dive today is structured around a really careful, thoughtful Bible essay. It was prepared specifically for adult Christians. And the mission here, it goes beyond just a simple historical summary. We want to try to extract, clarify, and then apply the main points of Elijah's ministry.
Yeah.
Especially focusing on that tension, between his incredible zeal and those desperate moments of human frailty.
And the essay makes this vital initial connection that I think frames the whole discussion.
What's that?
It emphasizes that Elijah's mission was fundamentally pastoral.
Pastoral. How so?
To turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, to prepare a people for the Lord. That mission, which is outlined in Malachi, it doesn't just end when Elijah ascends into heaven.
Ah, okay, so that's the whole forerunner concept. That's critical.
It is.
It's the bridge, really, between the Old Testament and the New. And we see that mandate fulfilled so powerfully centuries later with John the Baptist.
Precisely. The angel Gabriel, he explicitly announced that John would go before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah. And you see it in John the Baptist's whole life, right? The ascetic lifestyle, his rugged appearance, the leather belt, the camel hair, it's all these intentional echoes of Elijah. He was embodying that exact same spirit of uncompromising zeal to get Israel ready for the Messiah's first coming.
And Jesus himself affirmed this, didn't he? When he spoke of John, he said that if people were willing to accept it, John was the promised Elijah.
Yes.
So it wasn't like a reincarnation or anything like that, but a mantle, a spiritual office of preparing the way.
That's the essence of the essay's argument.
Yeah.
If John fulfilled that role in preparing a people for Christ's first advent, then the same spirit, that call to the church for wholehearted devotion away from the compromises of the age, that rests on believers now as we wait for Christ's guaranteed return.
So if that is the thread of preparation, then the main cable, I guess, running through Elijah's really confrontational and often violent time, that has to be the unwavering faithfulness of God.
That is the core theme. Elijah's life is a human-scale model of extremes. We see this profound zeal right next to paralyzing fear.
Spectacular courage, followed by this deep, deep dependence. And all of these human variables were held and ultimately shaped under the strong sovereign hand of the Lord.
So today, we'll follow the essay's structure. We need to start by setting the historical scene, just to fully grasp the spiritual crisis Elijah was walking into.
Right.
Then, we'll walk carefully through the dramatic narrative, analyze the theological weight of his ministry, and then we'll conclude by extracting the core spiritual lessons for us, for application in our daily lives. So let's start with that context. Elijah appears in the northern kingdom of Israel, which, by the time of King Ahab, had spiraled into this political and spiritual abyss. The essay is so clear on this. Ahab was historically bad. It says he did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any before him. What made Ahab reign so distinctly wicked, even worse than his predecessors?
Well, Ahab's wickedness wasn't just a personal failure. It was structural apostasy. He didn't just tolerate the golden calves that Jeroboam had set up. He institutionalized idolatry on a state level.
So he made it official policy. He did. He was directly challenging the covenant God. And his decision to marry Jezebel, a Sidonian princess, that just solidified all of it.
That marriage was the real spiritual calamity, wasn't it? It brought in Phoenician power and critically Phoenician religion right into the heart of Israel.
Exactly. And Jezebel didn't come to just, assimilate. She came to conquer spiritually. She aggressively imported and established the worship of Baal as the dominant, acceptable public religion.
This wasn't just some side cult, then?
Not at all. This was state-sponsored idolatry. It was funded by the palace, and tragically, it was enforced through violence against the prophets of Yahweh.
Okay, so let's break down Baal worship for a minute. Why was it so appealing? Especially to, a settled agricultural people like Israel. What was the practical temptation there?
Well, Baal was the ultimate nature god. He was promoted as the master of the storm, the atmosphere, and crucially, the fertility cycle.
Ah.
So in an agrarian society, the promise of Baal was immediate. It was tangible prosperity, rain for the crops, abundant harvests, and guaranteed children.
It sounds a bit like a guaranteed prosperity gospel, promising instant worldly success.
It really was.
Yeah.
But these promises came bound to a profoundly corrupt practice. The rites associated with Baal worship, temple prostitution, self-mutilation, even human sacrifice in some traditions. They were deeply offensive to the Creator. They twisted human sexuality and blasphemed the sanctity of life.
And they were available.
They were sensory, immediate, and culturally common among all the nations surrounding Israel.
What's so crucial here, and the essay really underscores this, is that the average Israelite probably didn't entirely abandon Yahweh.
No.
They wanted to keep the historical covenant protection of the Lord, but they also wanted the immediate material benefit and, the cultural relevance that Baal promised.
And that leads us to the crucial theological term, syncretism. It's so essential for us to grasp the danger here. Syncretism is the blending of fragments of true worship with the fever, the practices, and the idols of the surrounding nations. It's an attempt to put the God of the covenant on a shelf right next to other deities.
So if the Lord commanded, "You shall have no other gods before me," syncretism is the ultimate violation of that first commandment, isn't it?
It's the subtle, slow poison that destroys devotion. The inevitable result of syncretism is blurred loyalty. It just hollows out sincere love and devotion for the God who saved them from Egypt.
So they wanted the best of both worlds.
Israel wanted the spiritual insurance policy of Yahweh, but the immediate material thrills, the cultural acceptance, and the political expediency that was offered by Baal.
So into this chaotic, compromised culture, the Lord raises up Elijah. He just appears with no pedigree, no background introduction, almost like a flash of lightning.
Yes.
And his identity is a total contradiction to everything Ahab and Jezebel stood for.
His very presence was a confrontation. His name, the Lord is God, was a direct theological slap against the name Baal, which also means Lord or Master. And his first action was the opening shot in the war against Baal's domain.
He announced a severe drought. "There shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word."
This specific judgment was a brilliant, strategic, and necessary act of divine revelation. If Baal was the storm god, the one who controlled the elements necessary for life in Israel,
then a multi-year drought proves he's powerless.
Utterly powerless, an expensive non-entity, the judgment cut right to the core of the nation's false confidence.
So it wasn't just punishment, but revelation. The drought was the Lord proving that He alone, Yahweh, governs the sky and the soil. He alone decides when life flourishes and when it withers.
And the essay highlights that this immediate threat required Elijah to withdraw. The moment he spoke that word, he became the most wanted man in the kingdom. And that withdrawal and his subsequent hidden life taught him and us a profound lesson about dependency.
The sources describe him as a rugged man who moved in wilderness places.
That ruggedness speaks to God choosing the humble, unpolished instrument. It also highlights that God keeps his servants even when obedience costs them everything: comfort, safety, and reputation.
God's presence isn't confined to Ahab's palace or the grand altars of Baal.
Yes.
Not at all. He meets his people in the most desolate, unexpected places, in ravines, with daily provision, and in remote caves. This period of isolation was Elijah's training ground. It taught him utter dependence before his big public demonstration.
And we have to remember, the political environment made this dependence non-negotiable. Jezebel wasn't just sponsoring Baal, she was actively paying and feeding hundreds of false prophets,
while simultaneously hunting the Lord's faithful messengers across the land.
It was a literal violent cleansing, which leads us to that striking, quiet detail we find in the text. Obadiah, the official in Ahab's court, who risked his position and his life to hide 100 of the Lord's prophets in 2 caves, supplying them with food and water.
That detail is so crucial. It contrasts Elijah's public, fiery zeal with the quiet, costly obedience required by the faithful remnant. While Elijah was in the wilderness, Obadiah was operating right under the nose of the enemy.
It shows that God preserves a hidden, faithful group even when public life tilts completely toward violence and deception. And the stakes were life and death. Faithfulness was measured in both the spectacular fire and the quiet delivery of bread and water to a dark cave.
So by the time Elijah emerges for the confrontation at Carmel, the context is crystal clear. The nation is compromised, the Lord's authority is contested, and the stakes are the spiritual survival of Israel.
Right.
He wasn't asking them to pick a new liturgical flavor. He was forcing a choice between covenant and betrayal.
It was an all-or-nothing moment, summarized in the question he would later pose. How long will you waver between two opinions? The historical background proves this was an existential choice, not some minor theological dispute.
Let's pick up the narrative thread then. After announcing the drought, Elijah's first destination for protection was the Kerith ravine, and the Lord fed him by ravens, which is such a striking detail in itself.
The ravens are a fascinating symbol of God using the improbable, aren't they? Ravens were ceremonially unclean birds, yet they were commissioned by God to bring food to his holy prophet.
It really emphasizes that God's methods of provision are entirely sovereign. They work outside of human expectation or even, religious neatness.
And he was fed until the brook, his only source of water, dried up, which is a stark physical reminder that the judgment he proclaimed was real, even for him.
And when that stream failed, God sent him on the second leg of his retreat, north to Zarephath.
Yes.
The essay points out the geographical significance here. Zarephath was in Sidonian territory, that's Jezebel's home turf, near modern Lebanon. Why would the Lord send his prophet directly into the enemy's camp?
Well, it was strategically weak for a Hebrew prophet, but it was spiritually powerful for God's purposes. He was sent to a Gentile widow, a person of recognized poverty, whom he met collecting sticks outside the gate.
Preparing what she thought would be the last meal for her and her son.
Exactly.
That is just profound. In a famine, a poor, non-Israelite widow's home would have been the absolute last place anyone searching for the prophet of Yahweh, especially Jezebel's agents, would ever look. It was a perfect hiding spot, protected by its own obscurity and poverty.
And the theology of this placement is overwhelming. God bypasses the kings, the wealthy, even the established structure of Israel to sustain his prophet, using a Gentile woman whose only possession was a handful of flour and a little oil. It foreshadows the breadth of God's grace outside the covenant people.
So Elijah asked for bread, and in return, he gave this promise rooted in covenant faith. The jar of flour and the jug of oil would not empty until the Lord sent rain. And this provision, the source material suggests, likely lasted for most of the 3.5 years of the drought.
And her response is the foundation of the miracle. Simple, costly obedience. She believed the word of the Lord spoken through the prophet, despite the impossibility of the situation. Her faith, demonstrated by her actions, sustained her household in the very heart of idol-worshipping territory.
But then the devastating turn. The widow's son falls sick and dies. This is a moment where human grief immediately hardens into theology.
Yes. Her fear was, have you come to call my sin to remembrance and kill my son? This crisis teaches us that even when we've experienced incredible miracles of provision, death and suffering can instantly introduce profound spiritual doubt and fear. She feared the presence of God's holiness embodied in the prophet had exposed her past guilt.
So how does Elijah handle this crisis of theology?
He doesn't offer a philosophical debate. He takes the dead child upstairs, lays him on his own bed, and stretches himself over the boy 3 times, crying out to the Lord.
The stretching. It's an intense physical act of intercession, isn't it?
It is. It mirrors the human vulnerability of the child and emphasizes the prophet's total dependence on God for the impossible. And the Lord hears, and life returns.
The essay draws a powerful parallel here, noting that this experience, a great spiritual victory immediately followed by a valley of paralyzing doubt. It mimics Elijah's later trajectory after Mount Carmel.
It connects his story to our own. The Apostle Paul later speaks of being afflicted so that we might learn to rely not on ourselves but on God who raises the dead. And the widow's eventual confession that the word in the prophet's mouth was true became the moral and spiritual precursor for the entire nation's confession on Mount Carmel. She found her certainty in resurrection power.
And that leads us, after 3.5 years of waiting, directly to the great confrontation at Mount Carmel.
The big one.
This was the national spectacle, intended to end divided loyalties once and for all.
And the setup was brilliant in its simplicity and its fairness. Elijah summoned King Ahab, the entire nation, and the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who ate at Jezebel's table.
And the rules were absolute. Prepare 2 bowls, but light no fire. The God who answers with fire, consuming the sacrifice, that one is God.
And this setup, as the essay notes, it actually favored Baal, the supposed storm and fire deity.
It did.
And the frenzy of the false prophets lasted for hours, from morning until noon. They shouted, they slashed themselves, a characteristic of Baal rites designed to physically force the deity's attention.
And Elijah taunts them, suggesting their God must be meditating or perhaps busy or maybe sleeping. This taunt is a crucial moment. It exposes the foolishness and the desperation of idol worship.
And they continued their desperate performance until the time of the evening sacrifice, all without any answer.
Now contrast that desperate failure with Elijah's calm, methodical preparation. He didn't rush. He called the people near him, emphasizing the public nature of what was about to happen.
And his first act was deeply symbolic. He repaired the dilapidated altar of the Lord using exactly 12 stones. This act, in the middle of a national schism, was a powerful, non-verbal declaration that the entire nation, all 12 tribes, belonged under the authority of the one covenant God, Yahweh. It was a call to spiritual and national reunification.
And then the daring act of confidence that made the subsequent miracle entirely undeniable, dousing the whole thing with water. Not just once, but 3 times, until that precious, life-sustaining liquid saturated the wood, the sacrifice, and filled the trench he had dug around the altar.
Water, 3.5 years into a catastrophic drought, was more valuable than gold. To use it so liberally was a daring display of confidence in a God who didn't need any trickery or, fire assistance. And the trench, designed to hold a significant volume, ensured that any ambiguity about the sacrifice being consumed would be eliminated. If fire fell, it had to consume the water, the stones, and the soil.
And Elijah's prayer itself is short and powerful. He asked not for a dramatic spectacle, but that the people would know 3 things: that the Lord is God, that Elijah is his servant, and crucially, that God was turning their hearts back. It was a prayer for revelation and repentance.
The answer was immediate. The fire of the Lord fell with this impossible consuming force. The text says it consumed not just the sacrifice and the wood, but the stones of the altar, the soil underneath, and all the water in the trench. This was not natural fire. This was divine, total consumption.
And the response from the people was total confession. They fell on their faces, shouting Elijah's own confession back to him, "The Lord, he is God."
And this moment of confession leads to the brutal, necessary consequence noted in the source material. Elijah ordered the execution of the false prophets. The essay makes clear this was required under Deuteronomic law for those who deliberately led Israel into apostasy.
So in the context of the covenant, this was an act of covenant enforcement.
Exactly. It affirmed the legal and divine consequences of idolatry and betrayal. However, the political reality was that this act guaranteed Jezebel's personal, violent revenge.
Following the fire, the drought had to break. So Elijah ascended Carmel and prayed for rain, physically assuming this posture of desperate yearning, bending down and putting his face between his knees.
He prayed repeatedly, sending his servants 7 times to look toward the sea. The first 6 times, nothing. The 7th, the servant saw only a small cloud the size of a man's hand.
And Elijah immediately knew.
He knew that God had answered, and he instructed Ahab to ride quickly before the ensuing storm trapped him.
And then Elijah ran ahead of the king's chariot all the way to Jezreel, something like 20 miles.
This run, sometimes seen as just a burst of energy, was an act of public witness and prophetic zeal. It was ensuring the king could not escape the reality of God's intervention, and that the report of the miracle reached Jezebel directly before any corrupted, minimized version of the events could circulate in the capital.
But then, immediately following the highest mountain peak of his ministry, the spectacle of fire, confession, and torrential rain, we see this profound, low swing. Jezebel sends a messenger vowing revenge, and the man who stood against 850 false prophets runs for his life. First to Beersheba, and then alone into the wilderness where he prays to die.
This is the critical, relatable pivot in the story. It reveals the true cost of spiritual warfare and zeal. It's a descent into profound physical and emotional exhaustion, burnout, fear, and a sense of absolute isolation. He sat down under a broom bush, completely done.
The Lord's response here is not fire and thunder, but extraordinary tenderness. The essay calls it gentle medicine for a soul wrung dry by fear and fatigue.
Absolutely. The angel of the Lord didn't give him a spiritual lecture. He gave him sleep, baked bread, and water, twice, insisting that the prophet not continue his journey without first attending to his basic physical needs.
It's a powerful, profound reminder that caring for the body rest, food, and water is often a vital means of grace for preventing spiritual and emotional despair.
Exactly. The essay rightly connects this to finding peace through focusing on basic needs and thanksgiving.
So, strengthened by this provision, Elijah traveled for 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. That 40-day journey is a significant parallel, isn't it?
Oh, it's huge. It connects him directly to Moses, who received the law there, and it anticipates Jesus, who fasted 40 days in the wilderness. It signifies a profound, foundational spiritual encounter was necessary for the prophet's recommissioning. Elijah was seeking God's purpose in his solitude.
And when he lodged in the cave, the Lord drew him out. This is where the lesson about God's self-revelation shifts entirely from public spectacle to private intimacy.
The Lord passed by, and Elijah witnessed the spectacular displays he might have expected. The great wind tearing the mountains, the earthquake, and the fire. But the text is explicit. The Lord was not in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire.
He came in a gentle whisper. This is the moment that completely dismantles any false assumptions Elijah, or we might hold, about how the Almighty must always operate.
It does.
God is not confined to the flashy, the loud, or the dramatic revival. He speaks quietly sometimes to the lonely person in a remote place, confirming his intimate presence.
And he then questioned Elijah twice, asking, "What are you doing here?" And Elijah, focused only on his own zeal and personal failure, complained that he was the only one left.
And the Lord's response to that complaint was both gentle and correcting. He recommissioned Elijah for the next leg of his journey and provided the immense comfort that Elijah was not alone.
Right. There was a faithful remnant of 7,000 who had not bowed the knee to Baal.
The Lord also gave him new tasks, including anointing Elisha as his successor. This begins the final phase of Elijah's ministry, moving from grand public confrontation to the quiet, grinding work of justice and discipleship.
And the focus shifts dramatically to the issue of social ethics with Naboth's vineyard.
This wasn't a question of theology, it was a matter of basic human rights and legal righteousness.
Indeed. It was a profound test of whether royal power Ahab and Jezebel would be restrained by the law of righteousness, which protected the vulnerable and prevented the seizing of ancestral land. When Jezebel engineered a sham trial to murder Naboth and seize his field, it was a profound act of injustice against the innocent.
And Elijah met Ahab in that vineyard and pronounced a fearful verdict.
He assured the king that judgment would fall and that dogs would lick up his blood in the exact place where they had licked Naboth's. And though it was delayed by Ahab's temporary repentance, this prophecy ultimately proved true for both him and Jezebel, demonstrating that God's word of justice is inescapable and never fails.
Later, the prophet continued to exercise his confrontational authority with King Ahaziah, Ahab's son, who, after being injured in a fall, chose to consult a pagan god for an answer.
And Elijah's question to Ahaziah is arguably one of the most pressing questions of the whole narrative, relevant even today.
Is it because there is no God in Israel that you go elsewhere for answers?
It calls out the spiritual poverty of seeking solutions from the world or false ideologies when the living God is ready to answer.
It does.
And we see that striking little parable of the 3 captains sent to arrest him. 2 captains, demanding Elijah come down with threats and authority, were consumed by fire from heaven. But the 3rd captain, who came humbly and begged for his life, was spared.
That small parable illustrates the posture required before divine authority. God reserves judgment for the proud and arrogant, but offers grace to the humble who recognize the prophet's authority flows directly from God.
The narrative then closes with Elijah's final act and his departure. He struck the Jordan River with his cloak, parting the waters so he and Elisha could cross on dry ground. This is such a powerful capstone. It links his entire ministry and the subsequent ministry of Elisha back to the foundational acts of Moses, who parted the Red Sea. It's a divine reminder that the Lord who split the waters at the beginning can certainly make a way for his faithful servants in every generation.
And when Elisha asked for a double portion of his spirit, a request Elijah passed on to God, it wasn't a request for twice the power, was it?
No, it was for the inheritance of the firstborn son, signifying his role as Elijah's legitimate, primary spiritual successor.
It was a request for the necessary authority and grace to carry on the prophetic office, the legacy of service.
Exactly. And Elijah told him it would only be granted if he saw his departure. And he did. Chariots and horses of fire appeared, and Elijah ascended in a whirlwind. He was only the 2nd man after Enoch recorded as not tasting death.
That remarkable ending culminates centuries later in his final appearance on the Mount of Transfiguration with Moses and Jesus.
This narrative thread is so intentional. Moses represents the law. Elijah represents the prophets. Their presence with Christ underscores that Jesus is the fulfillment of everything that came before him, tying the entire redemptive history together. So moving now to the theological weight of this life, the most dominant doctrinal claim in Elijah's ministry is the absolute holiness and exclusivity of God. This is the heart of the covenant.
Right. On Carmel, in the courts, and even in the quiet of his refuge, Elijah continually pressed Israel to abandon the fundamental lie that idols and covenant love could coexist.
Yes.
The Lord Yahweh refuses to be treated as one option among many in the marketplace of deities.
And the miracles function as theological statements reinforcing this. The drought was a negation of Baal's power. The consuming fire was a declaration of Yahweh's ultimate consuming power and holiness. These acts were designed to expose the impotence of false gods and the folly of trusting them.
But the gentle whisper at Horeb is equally critical, perhaps more so for our private faith. It exposed any lingering assumption that God must always reveal himself in spectacle, in noise, or in public success.
The essay really emphasizes the profound contrast between the fire on Carmel and the whisper at Horeb. Carmel was God revealing his sovereignty to the nation. Horeb was God revealing his tenderness to his exhausted servant. He proved he is near the broken and the lowly whose strength is gone.
So we have to recognize that the God who demands exclusive, consuming devotion, the fire, is also the God who intimately cares for the individual servant in their moment of profound psychological and spiritual breakdown. The whisper, that duality is the bedrock of his nature.
And that distinction has immense practical implications. It challenges our modern assumptions that successful ministry must always look like large movements or dramatic numbers. God deliberately chooses the quiet, intimate medium to deliver the essential next steps of instruction to the prophet, demonstrating he works both in the spectacular and the solitary.
Another major theological theme saturating Elijah's life is the power of prayer. His life is defined by moments of radical intercession, stopping the rain, raising the dead child, bringing the rain back.
These moments transcend mere human petition. They demonstrate the mysterious, glorious meeting point of God's sovereignty and human pleading. The theological point here is foundational. God decrees the ends, and he ordains the means.
Okay.
He sovereignly chose to use the bold, obedient, and relentless intercession of his prophet to bring about what he had already purposed to do. Our prayers are not simply passive requests. They are the active, ordained means by which God accomplishes his will in the world.
That understanding that prayer is a necessary, ordained means, it elevates our intercession from a duty to a central privilege in aligning ourselves with the divine will.
Precisely. James tells us Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, yet his fervent prayer achieved results because it was aligned with the heart of God. It encourages us that our humanity does not disqualify us from being instruments of God's sovereign power.
Finally, Elijah serves as this indispensable bridge connecting the Old Testament promise to the New Testament hope. We touched on Malachi's prophecy that Elijah would come before the great and dreadful day of the Lord to turn the hearts.
And as we affirmed, Jesus confirmed John the Baptist fulfilled this role as the forerunner to Christ's first advent. John prepared the hearts for the arrival of the Messiah as the suffering servant.
But the New Testament leaves open further discussion, doesn't it? Some theological traditions, often tied to dispensational thought, point to the possibility of an Elijah-like witness in a future time of trouble, symbolized by the two witnesses in Revelation 11.
The essay is cautious here, stressing the necessity of avoiding dogmatism, where Scripture is silent on specific future identities. Our core certainty rests on what is revealed. The Lord is faithful to all his distinct promises. The preservation of the faithful remnant of 7,000 in Elijah's day mirrors how God preserves a remnant now through the gospel.
The ultimate certainty, then, is Christ's final reign. God is consistent in his commitment to his people, ensuring that righteousness will fill the earth when Christ returns.
His faithfulness anchors our hope, whether through the preservation of Israel or the gathering of the nations through the church. Both movements reflect his unwavering commitment and consistency across all ages.
So now we shift from analysis to application. How do these high points of theological truth reshape our practical, everyday obedience? The first crucial lesson Elijah gives us is the mandate for single-hearted devotion in a culture defined by compromise.
This is the primary confrontation of his ministry. He faced a nation that wanted the safety net of the Lord coupled with the immediate pleasures and cultural validation of Baal. And Elijah's question, it just cuts through all layers of compromise and self-justification. How long will you waver between two opinions?
The application isn't complex. It's radical. It's a renewed allegiance, not a new technique. We have to consciously, daily choose whom we will serve.
And that choice demands practical manifestation, or it's meaningless. The essay challenges us to order our practical habits, in public and in private, to fit that choice. How do we spend our budget? How do we use our body? What language do we use? These are the arenas where our loyalty to the Lord is tested. He is worthy of total allegiance, not just part-time loyalty that compromises with the idols of cultural acceptance, materialism, or fear.
Lesson 2 is deeply encouraging because it deals with the emotional reality of spiritual warfare, courage that must depend entirely on grace. We talked about that immediate swing from the mountain of Carmel to the despair of the broom bush.
It's the most human part of the narrative. Many devoted servants of God, after pouring out immense effort, whether in public ministry or just diligent faithfulness, experience that dramatic drop into exhaustion and paralyzing doubt. Elijah's reaction proves that zeal does not grant immunity from fear.
And the Lord's response is the essential lesson for us. He didn't criticize Elijah's fear. He offered tenderness, rest, food, and the comfort of his presence delivered through the simple physical means of an angel.
This is the practical action item for you when discouragement hits hard. When stress whispers that you are isolated, that you are a failure, or that the work is too much, the remedy begins by receiving the care he provides through ordinary means. Rest, proper nutrition, trusted fellowship, and withdrawing long enough to find stillness. We must rise again in the strength he gives, not the strength we can muster.
We have to remember the essay's insight here. Elijah was not recommissioned with a burst of self-help or some pumped-up motivation, but with tasks scaled to grace and the comforting news that he was never truly alone.
Lesson 3 pivots to the public sphere. Contending for justice, as seen in Naboth's vineyard. Faithfulness to God cannot be separated from faithfulness to our neighbor and the defense of the vulnerable.
Right. The Naboth incident demonstrates that the Lord defends the innocent and requires his servants to speak truth to corrupt power.
And the application for thoughtful adult Christians is vital here. We must learn the same plain speech, spoken always in love and mercy, contending for truth and righteousness without fear or favor in our cultural moment. The prophet's role included calling out economic and social abuses just as much as it involved condemning idolatry. Worship must be ethically grounded.
Finally, Elijah gives us the lesson of preparation and legacy. Ministry is not solely about the individual spectacular moments, but the investment of life in another, specifically Elisha.
Elijah found Elisha at the plow, threw his mantle over him, and allowed him to walk alongside, learning for years until the mantle fell for good. This is the model of discipleship. We must prepare others for the work, ensuring the word of the Lord is carried forward across generations.
And that enduring mission of Elijah, the forerunner, to turn hearts and prepare the Lord's way, now rests on every believer.
It does. It means preparing people for the Lord's appearing by simple obedience, a clear witness that rejects the idols of the age, and a robust love for truth and neighbor. The ultimate goal is not to be a famous messenger, but to embody a steady faithfulness that consistently points beyond the messenger to the King himself.
As we conclude this deep dive, the connecting line throughout Elijah's life is beautifully clear. It stretches from the beginning of the spectacular drought to the breaking of the incredible rain, and from the consuming fire of judgment to the intimate whisper of grace. But the constant connection is the unwavering sovereign faithfulness of the Lord.
He alone is God. He sends the word that judges and the mercy that restores. He alone answers prayer, provides life for the dead, and gives courage for the faint. He raises up and removes his servants, writing verdicts that history cannot erase.
And it is so incredibly important as we carry the memory of such a giant of the faith to remind ourselves, as James did, that Elijah was fundamentally a man with a nature like ours. He was susceptible to exhaustion, deep fear, and doubt. Yet, the Lord used him mightily, proving he is near to all who call on him in truth and fear his name.
And this brings us back to that crucial, deeply personal lesson at the end of the narrative, received when the prophet was at his lowest point. Elijah had witnessed the greatest displays of power imaginable, fire, earthquake, wind, yet God chose a different medium entirely for intimacy and instruction at Horeb.
Let's focus on that passage one last time, just to capture the lesson the prophet received on the mountain of God.
Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind came an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper.
While the final trajectory of Elijah's story points ahead to the dramatic events of Christ's return, the profound encouragement here is for our immediate, daily faithfulness. God often chooses to work not in the spectacular noise that distracts us, but in the quiet, intimate moments of the gentle whisper, drawing us out of our despair to listen.
It reminds us that our primary job, regardless of the scale of our current zeal or the depth of our despair, is to be still enough to hear that quiet voice, to receive the recommissioning, and to take the next faithful step in the work he has assigned us. May the Lord grant you ears to hear his gentle whisper clearly this week, and the courage and grace to follow where that quiet voice leads you. Amen.